Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
Hey everyone, B1B Flyer here. In this video, I'm going to show you another way to help you paint glass canopy areas on your miniatures. The process will differ from my previous videos in that it won't start from a dark or black color and work up to the brighter ones. This is a reverse method of highlighting, where we mostly take away the brightest colors gradually, working towards the darkest so we don't have to paint super fine lines or edges. On my Stormchrome model, I'm using artwork from the Battle of Tukayid book as a reference. As you can see, there's a ton of angled surfaces and hard edges. I'll show you how skipping all of that endgame edge highlighting and tight blending will be easier and less stressful. If you're new to blending reflections and detail painting, I recommend a miniature with an easily accessible canopy with only a few large and defined individual flat surfaces, as opposed to this complex one that I'm showing here. Something like this rifleman would be a good option, and the Tukayid book has several examples of other mechs for inspiration for both flat and rounded surface reflections. If you haven't seen the rounded cockpit tutorial, I'll have it linked at the end of this video. Here's the paints I used. Keep in mind you don't have to start with an ivory or white, nor take it all the way back to black. I'm using Iosin green, dark green, and Army Painter dark tone wash, but similar colors can easily be substituted. You'll need a good quality brush with a fine point to get the best results. I'm using a Monument Hobbies 00 Kolinsky as I find it a good balance of sharp point and enough barrel or bristles to hold a useful amount of paint before it dries out. If you own one, I recommend using a wet palette, as there can be times when going back and forth between darker and lighter tones may be needed for touch-ups, as well as keeping your paints thin to facilitate more gradual transitions and blends. That being said, I'm not using one in this video. Instead, I've got my usual palette paper that I've added a drop of airbrush flow improver to each color, and a small amount of water when needed. You can substitute a bit of glaze medium or wash medium as well if you don't have the flow improver. The idea is to get a bit of a working time with the paint before it dries on your brush and the canopy itself. I typically paint my canopies and reflective surfaces towards the end of the painting process to avoid messing it up with any weathering or work near that area. Because I like the finished appearance of shiny glass, I apply an acrylic gloss varnish, so it's usually the very last thing I do to a miniature before I complete it. That doesn't preclude me from blocking in the base color or colors at some point before this step. So if it's convenient, I'll put a bit of color on them while painting the miniature to prep the areas for later. That being said, I didn't know I was going to paint this canopy in this color or style until after I'd nearly finished the miniature, so I had to go up from black to a green to start out. Because I didn't already have a lighter color base coat, you've been seeing me work up some Iosin green over the black as I've been explaining things. I had to be careful not to get it anywhere on the red or metallic areas that were finished. Thinking about paint transparency, if you want an even brighter finished look to whatever colors you apply, then you can start with an ivory or a white base coat, something like that perhaps over a light brown to get even coverage. I'm going for a bit more natural and subdued effect to mimic the muted greens from the example art, so a mid-tone green is just fine. After working up a couple layers of green, it's time to add the brightest highlight color to the raised edges in any areas of interest. Using the artwork as a guide, I'm being fairly liberal with my application. I'm not being sloppy, but I am trying to match the general shape of the brighter reflection areas, although larger than what I would want at the end to give me more to work with and reverse the colors later. Depending on the color you use and the intensity of the paint, you may need to do this more than once to build up the brightness that you're happy with. Remember, you have to think about this in reverse order, and this is the step to make those tiny final highlights as bright as you can and anticipate them needing to be as bright as possible, so it's better to go brighter than not bright enough. Otherwise, we aren't avoiding the end game of having to do those little tiny touches of just the brightest color at the very end. Once you have all the areas of highest reflection painted, it's time to start working in reverse. You can see I now have several colors on my palette paper, and I've mixed some ivory with some Iosin green to start the shift back from the raised sharp edges on the canopy. It's almost a seafoam green color, which I wish I would have just added a hint of yellow to at the time, but I'll go over how I solved that at the end of the video. I'm taking this lighter green and pushing it up to the near edge of where I want to have just thin strips of that ivory edge highlight. I tend to start away from the edge and just push the paint gently towards the highest brightness point and stop before going over it. I'm using just very tiny controlled strokes, and it's essentially a stippling technique, but I'm not pushing the tip of my brush directly down on the surface. It's up to you on how thin you want to make the defined bright area, and it may take some practice before you're able to really thin the line down, but stick with it. If you make a mistake, try to gently wipe away the color with your finger. If you need to go back and re-establish the lightest area, be as careful as you can, treat it like an edge highlight if possible, and then let it dry before you go back and try again. Now I'm going in using the mid-tone Iosin green and repeating the same process, but now only going up to the seafoam color and leaving a band of color showing with that. I'm also working the color towards the areas I know will be darker green or black, so there's more surface area being covered in this step. But on the model I'm working on, it's still so very small that it's hard to tell on each individual angle panel. You can see I've got all my colors on my palette, so I can quickly adjust colors to build my blends. If you wish, you can start to add a bit of darker or lighter color to your tones as you see fit in each area. This will help the transitions look that much smoother and show some variation in the reflection shapes. I'm going to start using some dark tone wash from Army Painter to add to my dark green. This allows me to darken the green much more gradually and controlled than if I just use straight black paint. Because black pigment is so strong, if you only have black paint available to you, I'd recommend thinning it down to a wash consistency before adding it. As I add the darkest tones, it starts to make a dramatic difference. Be careful on this step and go slow. Work up to your edges and take a couple layers to establish the darkest areas. If it gets too close to the lighter greens, go back and work a bit of the brighter color back over and then mix in a slight amount of the wash or black to smooth it back out. Let that thin paint dry completely and look at it and see if you need to change or fix anything. The color can change as it dries completely and mute out. If you don't have anything to change, great! I, on the other hand, found some areas I wanted to go back and adjust with more variation to show some of the darkest contrast blending to the hazy green reflection areas. I simply found areas that I wanted to work and kept my paints thin. I would say thinner than when I was first applying them, so if that helps you understand what I'm working with now. I'm now doing very thin and quick glazes over small areas. Working with small brush strokes just as with every other blend, I gradually change the areas by adjusting the value of the green with my ivory or black. I didn't have to go back and adjust the brightest ivory highlight more than a couple of times, and those were some of the larger areas that needed to add a touch of paint, which was really the goal of this entire process. I didn't want to have to try to edge highlight and paint every single shape and line with those super bright colors. I know I've cut ahead to various stages of the work throughout the video, but that's to avoid having you watch me paint a dozen or so panels the same way for too long. Overall, the actual unedited length of this process that I filmed was about 30 minutes. I don't think that's all that bad considering the number of individual panels and the fine-tuning I did for about 10 minutes or so at the end. Here you can see a close-up compared to the example art of how things turned out before I glossed the canopy. I did want to go back to my comment about not adding a bit of yellow early on. I looked at the example artwork more and more and compared it to the Timberwolf colors and decided I kind of like that yellow-green hue more. So I made a very, very thin glaze of Flash Gitz yellow. I'm talking dirty paint water thin, and used it to filter the ivory and the lighter greens. You could do this with just about any color over your light highlights as well, but keep in mind you'll lose your pure white colors or would need to go back and add them in again if you needed to adjust them. I didn't do that as I liked the more muted look to the reflections in this case, since it matched the artwork fairly closely. I also did a similar workup with some reds and orange to mimic another example in the book. Here they both are after being glossed. I really liked the final results and it was fun attacking this process differently than I'm normally used to. That's all I've got for now. Over to you, Tex.
We certainly hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe and leave your questions or comments below. Follow us on Facebook at Battletech Camo Specs Online. Check out our website at camospecs.com. Thank you for watching and we'll see you next time. Shutdown sequence initiated.